I can tell you that for people on my side of the aisle, one of the concerns we should have is if today the national emergency is border security and it entitles them to go out and do something, we all support that. Tomorrow, the national security emergency might be, climate change. So let's seize fossil fuel plants or something.
President Trump's insistence that there's a crisis at the border for which he might declare a national emergency has focused people's minds on what real crises actually are. There's a growing consensus, particularly among Democrats, that the one overarching crisis we face is climate change. Take a look at this graphic showing temperature anomalies, both hot and cold, in countries around the world over the past 40 years. And watch as the yellow, orange, and red spots representing higher temperature anomalies come on screen with ever-increasing frequency. Just this week, new scientific analysis shows the Earth's oceans are warming 40% faster than what was estimated just 5 years ago. It's a far bigger crisis than anything happening at the border. Congressman Ro Khanna of California supports efforts to combat climate change like the Green New Deal, a proposal pushed by newly elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, among others, and he joins me now. What do you think about all this? I've seen a lot of people in the midst of the last few days saying, wait a second, we can declare a national emergency over this. Why don't we do it about climate change?
Well, climate change actually is the real crisis, but let me assure Senator Rubio that if a Democrat gets elected president, they actually understand constitutional law and would never do this. For example, if Elizabeth Warren were elected president, she knows that in Youngstown, the Supreme Court explicitly ruled that Harry Truman couldn't seize steel mills,
yes,
and that was to win the Korean War. So this idea, and actually if the president did declare an emergency, the House can overturn it in a joint resolution. So the level of ignorance by the Republicans on the actual law is outstanding, especially considering they're the party that is supposed to uphold the Constitution. Well, what the Democrats will do is actually build consensus in Congress and in the Senate to argue that this is what's creating jobs. Let me just put out two facts. There are more jobs being created in solar and wind, according to Fortune magazine, 12 times as fast as any other industry. In 2016, solar jobs grew 25%, wind jobs grew 32%. This is about economic growth, not just about the environment.
The other reason I think this is key at this moment is Democrats for years have said we should do something about climate. There was a Waxman-Markey bill that happened the last time there was unified Democratic control, though it didn't make it through the Senate. But that's different than saying we're in crisis and we need to mobilize for essentially a kind of peaceful equivalent to war, which is what many people are saying. Is that how you see it right now?
I do. I think that the crisis is so severe. And as you know, with the United Nations report, we were underestimating, all of us, the scientists, of how soon the crisis was going to hit. This is not something that we're talking about people's grandkids or even their kids. This is something that we're talking in 10 to 15 years. And by the way, people in this country are feeling the crisis. You can feel it if you live in Florida with the hurricanes being more severe because the water is warming. You can feel it in California with the wildfires because of the drought conditions that climate change is causing. So this is no longer a theoretical issue, and that's why people want to act.
Right, but that's different than saying it's the number one issue, that there has to be a domestic mobilization akin to something like the New Deal, akin to something like the national mobilization for World War II. I mean, that's the scale that I'm hearing people begin to talk about the government response at. And I wonder if that's the scale that you think of it at, and is that something that a lot of Democrats do, or a lot of people need to be persuaded to think of it in those terms?
I think increasingly people are thinking of it in those types of terms. And the reason for that is two things. One, people know that we have to think about the future of work. And there are a lot of parts of this country where people have been unemployed. And we have to figure out how do we put them back to work, especially with the digital transformation. And so people see that this is a place where you can actually grow jobs. And secondly, the climate change is an existential crisis. And for the longest time, we haven't been using bold enough language to deal with it. And I give a lot of credit to the Sunrise Movement, the newly elected freshmen, from bringing that urgency so that we can address this at the appropriate scale.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Sunrise Movement who sat in. There was this very sort of amazing thing that happened in Minnesota. Tim Walz was just elected governor there, and the climate activists announced they were going to sit in. And instead, once organizers informed the governor's office of a planned sit-in, the governor offered instead to meet with the young people. What you're asking for is concrete changes, which is what you should be asking for. The move is tangible evidence of where we're going to go. That's at the gubernatorial level. Counsel. I think that, what do you think that says about how seriously this has been taken, that governors are making this a day one issue?
I think those kids have done phenomenal. I mean, I know some people criticize them for sitting into offices and coming to Congress. Let me tell you, there would not have been the creation of the Select Committee if they hadn't mobilized. Now, the Select Committee for the Green New Deal isn't strong enough. I wish they had legislative authority. I wish they could subpoena. But all I would say to the Sunrise Movement is you made an incredible difference in about 60 days. Keep going. It's the only way we're going to get members of Congress to respond and treat this with the urgency that it requires.
What is your response if the president does declare, since that's the beginning of this trajectory, if the president does declare a national emergency, what should the Democratic response be?
We should invoke Section 5 of the National Emergency Act, which was put in place explicitly after Watergate because Nixon abused the emergency. Section 5 allows the House of Representatives to overturn through a joint resolution the president's emergency. The Senate would have 15 days to vote on it. I would assume that the Senate would not vote for the emergency based on all these conversations.
All right. Congressman Ro Khanna of California, thank you for coming by tonight.
Thank you.